My name is Evelyn Hayes, and at 30 years old, my world shattered on the sacred ground of my mother's grave. The person wielding the hammer, with a calculated cruelty that stole the very air from my lungs, was my own sister, Sarah. The day had been cold, a biting November wind that whipped stray leaves across the manicured cemetery lawns. I remember the scratchy feel of my black wool coat, the way I clutched a single white lily whose petals were already beginning to brown at the edges from the frost. We were marking the 1-year anniversary of our parents' death, a day I had been dreading for months. A small group of us stood there, a sad little island in a sea of granite and silence. And in that moment of shared grief, a moment that should have been holy, Sarah chose to strike. She waited until our aunts had moved. A few paces away, their quiet sobs carried on the wind, and then she turned to me. Her face was a perfect mask of tragedy, her eyes brimming with tears I now know were born of performance, not pain. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "I can't keep this inside anymore. It's eating me alive." Swore, right there, with the scent of damp earth and wilting flowers hanging heavy between us, that her newborn son, a tiny, innocent life I already loved with the full force of my soul, was my husband Mark's child. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning, like a broadcast in a language I didn't understand. It was a lie woven from the threads of pure, unadulterated greed and a lifetime of simmering envy. A lie designed to strip me of everything I held dear. My marriage, my dignity, and the inheritance our parents had spent their entire lives building for us. But what Sarah, in her calculated arrogance, had not accounted for was karma. And karma, as she was about to discover in the most spectacularly public fashion, has a way of exposing even the most tangled webs of deceit. What she claimed was a passionate mistake forged in the fires of grief was, in fact, a biological impossibility, an immutable scientific truth that would unravel her life in the most humiliating way imaginable. This is the story of how betrayal threatened to destroy everything I was, only to force me to orchestrate a comeback that would leave my treacherous sister with nothing but the ashes of her own avarice. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories. Before the storm, before the lie that poisoned the very air I breathed, my life was a portrait of serene contentment. Mark and I had been married for 7 years, and our love was the quiet, steady kind that deepens with each passing season like the roots of an old oak tree. It wasn't a romance of grand, cinematic gestures, but one built in the small, sacred rituals of daily life. It was in the way he'd make my coffee every morning, exactly how I liked it, a splash of oat milk, no sugar, and leave it on my nightstand to wake me. It was in the way I'd save the history documentaries I knew he'd love, and we'd watch them curled up on the sofa, my feet tucked under his leg. We lived in a cozy bungalow in a suburban town where the rhythm of life was slower, a place where the scent of freshly cut grass in the summer and the crackling warmth of a fireplace in winter were the soundtrack to our days. Mark was a high school history teacher, a man of infinite patience and solid principles, with a warm, rumbling laugh that had the power to make the bleakest days feel bright. He viewed the world through the lens of cause and effect, of truth and evidence, a characteristic that would soon become my anchor in a sea of chaos. He found beauty in facts, in the unchangeable truths of the past. History doesn't lie. "Ev," he'd often say, "people do, but the evidence always tells the story eventually." I, in turn, ran a small online bookstore from a sunlit room in our home that we'd converted into an office. It was a passion project that had blossomed into a thriving business. I loved the quiet, meticulous work, sourcing rare first editions, carefully packaging each book in brown paper and twine, writing personalized thank you notes to my customers. It was my small corner of the world, a place of order and narrative, where stories had clear beginnings, middles, and most importantly, just endings. My life was ordered, predictable, and profoundly happy. Our home wasn't grand, but it was a sanctuary built on mutual respect and shared dreams, every corner filled with books, comfortable armchairs, and the lingering aroma of coffee and old paper. Our parents, God rest their souls, had been the pulsating heart of our family. They were a living testament to enduring love, their partnership a gentle dance of affection and mutual support that had lasted for over 4 decades. My father, a quiet, thoughtful carpenter, taught me the value of sturdy, honest work. I can still smell the cedar shavings in his workshop, still see his large, calloused hands carefully crafting a piece of wood into something beautiful and useful. My mother, a vibrant woman with a passion for gardening, taught me about nurturing things, about the patience required to help something grow. Their sudden death in a car accident the year before had been a seismic shock, a cataclysm that had fractured the landscape of my life. It left a void that Sarah and I were supposed, in theory, to fill for each other. They left us the family. Home, a beautiful Victorian house with a sprawling garden that our mother had cultivated with an almost religious love and a considerable inheritance to be divided equally between us. The will was clear, but their final wish, expressed in countless conversations over the years, was even clearer. That we would always be there for each other, that the bond of sisterhood would be an unbreakable fortress against the world's adversities. "You two are all you have," my mother used to say, her hand on my arm. "Never forget that." It was a promise I intended to honor with every fiber of my being. Sarah and I had always been like day and night, oil and water. I was the quiet one, the introspective one, content with a good book and a steaming cup of tea. My idea of a perfect evening was the comfortable silence shared with Mark, the weight of a classic novel in my lap. She, on the other hand, was the whirlwind, a social butterfly with an insatiable desire for the spotlight. Sarah thrived on attention, on drama, on the admiration of others. She had been the prom queen, the popular girl, the one whose life seemed like a succession of exciting social events. I remember in high school, she could walk into a room and instantly become its center of gravity, her laughter loud and infectious, her stories dramatic and captivating. I was the one in the corner, observing, happy in my own world. Despite our abysmal differences, I loved her fiercely. Perhaps it was the instinct of an older sister, but I was her most fervent defender, her shoulder to cry on, the one who always saw the good in her, even when she made it incredibly difficult. I would excuse her slip-ups as "that's just how she is," and her small cruelties as "she didn't mean it." I was the steady rock to her chaotic wave. I never saw it as envy, but looking back now, the signs were always there, subtle and insidious. The way she would subtly belittle my achievements, framing my quiet contentment as a lack of ambition. "Oh, a bookstore? That's quaint, Ev," she'd once said, the word quaint dripping with condescension. The way she would always have to one-up my stories. If I'd had a trying day at work, her day had been a veritable catastrophe. My anecdotes were mundane. Hers were always more glamorous, her problems always more dramatic. She saw my stable, happy life not as something I had built, but as something that had simply fallen into my lap, something I didn't deserve as much as she did. When she announced her pregnancy, I was absolutely ecstatic. The news felt like the first ray of sunshine after a long, dark year of mourning. For the first time since the accident, I felt a flicker of genuine, uncomplicated joy. I pictured our children growing up together, cousins who would be like siblings, running through the gardens of our parents' old house, recreating the bond I so desperately believed we shared. The identity of the father, however, was a veiled mystery. Sarah was evasive, vaguely mentioning a brief, passionate affair with someone who was not in the picture, a man who, she claimed, wasn't ready for responsibility. She painted herself as the brave, abandoned woman, and I, in my eagerness to support her, accepted her story without question. I didn't press for details, choosing instead to respect her privacy and focus on the overwhelming joy of becoming an aunt. The idea of a baby in the family, a tiny being to shower with love, was a balm for the still raw grief of losing our parents. I threw myself into the role, helping her set up the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling the crib with my own hands. I bought tiny outfits and knitted a small lopsided blanket, dreaming of the future. I had no idea that, in her mind, every act of my kindness was simply more evidence of a life she coveted, every happy moment a reason for her resentment to grow. She was already weaving the web in which she planned to trap me. The first tremor of the earthquake that would soon demolish my life came subtly, disguised as neediness and grief. In the final trimester of her pregnancy, Sarah began spending an unusual amount of time at our house. She would often show up unannounced, usually in the late afternoon, just as Mark was getting home from work. She would praise him effusively, her compliments always slightly over the top. She would touch his arm when she laughed, a little too often. She would talk about how Mark was the kind of stable man every woman dreamed of having, casting significant glances in my direction that, at the time, I interpreted as melancholy for her own situation. "You're so lucky, Ev," she'd say with a dramatic sigh, settling onto our sofa as if she owned it. "To have someone so solid, someone you can count on. Some of us aren't so fortunate." I dismissed these signals as the behavior of a lonely, hormonal, and grieving sister seeking comfort and a sense of family stability now that our parents were gone. Mark, ever the kind and patient soul, was accommodating. He would fix her a cup of tea, listen to her lengthy complaints, and offer gentle advice. He treated her with the gentle warmth he extended to everyone, treating her like the sister he never had. I saw my husband's kindness and compassion. Sarah, it seems, saw an opportunity, a piece to be moved on her twisted chessboard. The day her son Leo was born, I was at the hospital, holding her hand through the worst of the contractions, my heart overflowing with a love so pure and intense it surprised me. He was beautiful, with a tuft of dark hair and large, curious eyes that seemed to observe the world with an ancient wisdom. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I felt an instant, primal connection, a silent vow to protect and love him forever. In that moment, he wasn't just my nephew, he was a piece of my heart. The world, for a brief, shining moment, felt right again. It was a few weeks later, during a visit to her small, cluttered apartment, that the first blow landed. The atmosphere was heavy with the smell of stale air and baby formula. She seemed exhausted, her usual vibrant energy replaced by a brittle, frayed edge. Little Leo was fussy, his small cries echoing off the thin walls. I was in the tiny kitchen, preparing a cup of tea for her, trying to bring a small pocket of calm to her chaotic environment when she said my name, Evelyn. The tone was flat, chilling, and it sent an immediate prickle of dread down my spine. I turned. She was sitting in a worn armchair, Leo cradled against her chest. Her eyes met mine, and they were filling with tears. "There's something. I need to tell you. It's about Leo." My heart stopped. I rushed to her side, sinking onto the ottoman at her feet, my immediate concern being the baby's health. "What is it, Sarah? Is he okay? Did something happen with the doctor?" She took a deep breath, a shuddering sigh that seemed to tear through her chest. "He's fine. Physically, he's perfect. It's not about his health." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air, thick with unspoken words, a vacuum that sucked all the hope from the room. Then she looked me directly in the eye, and with a chilling firmness that belied her tears, she uttered the two words that would detonate my world. "It's Mark." I stared at her, the words floating in the air, nonsensical. It was as if she'd spoken in a foreign language I couldn't decipher. Mark's name, coming from her mouth in that context, was a dissonance, a wrong note in a familiar melody. "What? Sarah, what are you talking about? That's impossible. It's ridiculous." "I know it's hard to believe," she sobbed, the sound echoing in the small apartment. She clutched Leo, who had started to cry in response to her distress, and pressed him to her chest as if he were a shield, a piece of living, breathing evidence of her story. But we had a moment of weakness. It was right after Mom and Dad died. We were both grieving. We were so lost. We were at the old house, sorting through some of their things. And we found comfort in each other. It was a mistake, Evelyn, a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but Leo is the result of it. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring into a gray tunnel. Mark? My Mark? The man who wrote me silly poems and left them on my pillow? The man who held me as I cried for days on end over the loss of my parents, his own grief a silent, steady presence beside me. The man whose character was as solid as the earth beneath my feet? It couldn't be true. It was a monstrous, absurd, inconceivable lie. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper, strangled by the disbelief and the pain that was starting to rise in my throat like bile. You're lying. Why would you say something like that? Why would you invent something so horrible? Why would I lie about something like this? She cried, her performance worthy of an award. Her eyes pleaded with me, begging me to believe her beautiful, tragic fiction. I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I swear I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't live with this secret anymore. You deserve to know the truth. And Leo, he deserves to know his father. Every word was a dagger, sharpened and aimed with deadly precision. It was calculated to inflict the maximum pain, to plant the most venomous seed of doubt. And despite everything in me screaming that it was a charade, a terrified little part of my brain, the part that knew the depths of despair that grief could cause, began to wonder, what if, in a single unguarded moment of shared sorrow, the unthinkable had happened? That tiny seed of doubt was all Sarah needed to begin her conquest. The days that followed Sarah's accusation were not lived, but endured. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching into an agonizing crawl where every minute was thick with dread. The world, which had once seemed solid and reliable, now tilted at a sickening angle, and I struggled to keep my balance. Her lie was a slow-acting poison, seeping into every thought, contaminating every memory, every corner of the life I had so carefully built. I would look at Mark, my husband of 7 years, the man whose every expression I thought I knew, and see a stranger. Against my will, the image she had planted, a scene of him and my sister, shrouded in the sanctimonious excuse of grief, would superimpose itself over his familiar face. It was a violation, not just of our marriage, but of my own mind. Sarah hadn't just made an accusation. She had implanted a putrid, vivid image that I couldn't exorcise no matter how hard I tried. I confronted Mark that same night. He came home from a late faculty meeting, his familiar scent of chalk dust and autumn air filling the hallway. I was waiting for him in the living room, sitting in the dark, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The words came out of me, clumsily, a raw and ugly mixture of accusation and pleading. I watched his face, illuminated by the single lamp I had turned on, as it crumbled while I repeated Sarah's story. The initial disbelief in his eyes, the almost comical confusion, quickly gave way to a horrified bewilderment, and finally to a pain so deep and profound it mirrored my own. He didn't just look hurt, he looked shattered, as if the very foundation of his world had been yanked out from under him. He denied it, of course, with a vehemence that on any other day of my life I would have believed without a second thought. His denial was absolute, his eyes clear and steady, filled with an honest anguish. "Evelyn, look at me," he pleaded, kneeling in front of me, his hands reaching for mine. His touch, which had always been my comfort, now felt electric with uncertainty. "I love you. I would never ever do something like that. With anyone, let alone your sister. This is insanity, a sick, twisted fabrication. Think about it. Think about us. And I wanted to believe him. Oh, how I wanted to. A part of me, the part that knew the quiet integrity of this man, the part that had built a life with him, screamed that he was telling the truth. But the seed of doubt, planted with such diabolical precision, had already taken root in the fertile soil of my grief. Sarah had been clever. She hadn't accused him of a sordid, lustful affair. She had framed it as a tragic, understandable mistake born of shared sorrow. She had used the sacred memory of our parents as the perfect weapon, creating a scenario that felt just plausible enough to be agonizing. The insidious premise of her story was that grief makes people unrecognizable, leads them to do unthinkable things, and it was a premise that was nearly impossible to completely refute with words alone. Our home, once a sanctuary of peace and love, became a silent battlefield, filled with unfinished conversations and a tension that hung in the air like smoke, making it hard to breathe. The injustice of it all was a physical weight, a constant pressure on my chest. Sarah, my own sister, had recast our family tragedy into a melodrama with herself as the tragic heroine. She had painted me as the naive, clueless wife, and Mark as a traitor, a man who would defile his vows with his grieving sister-in-law. And she played the part of the victim with a terrifying, Oscar-worthy mastery. Her face, in the days that followed, was perpetually bathed in tears. The baby, little Leo, became her most powerful prop. She would hold him tightly, her expression so powerful tableau of suffering and betrayed motherhood. She was the suffering Madonna. I was the deceived fool. The humiliation was a public spectacle. Sarah, with a sense of timing that was as cruel as it was calculated, ensured the truth came out. She didn't have to shout it from the rooftops. She just confided, her voice choked with sobs, to our Aunt Carol. That was all it took. Aunt Carol, the self-appointed town crier of our family, made sure the story spread like a plague through our small, interconnected town. Whispers followed me at the supermarket. Conversations would halt abruptly when I entered a shop, resuming in hushed tones the moment I was out of earshot. Old family friends, people who had known me since I was a little girl, looked at me with a new, unbearable mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, their eyes trying to find the signs of betrayal on my face. My own family, my aunts, uncles, and cousins, was divided. Some, who knew my character and Mark's, who had witnessed our solid, loving marriage for years, refused to believe it. They called, offering quiet, unwavering support. But others, swayed by Sarah's heart-wrenching performance, took her side. They looked at Mark with cold disdain and at me with a sorrow that felt like a judgment. They saw me as weak, as a woman who couldn't keep her husband. The humiliation wasn't just being betrayed, it was being seen as pathetic, a woman to be pitied. I remember one particularly excruciating encounter that etched itself into my memory. I was in the local bakery, a place I had always loved for its warm, yeasty smell and friendly faces, picking up a loaf of bread. I ran into Martha, a lifelong friend of my mother's, a woman whose home I had played in as a child. Her face, usually so warm and cheerful, became a mask of strained sympathy. "Oh, Evelyn, dear," she said, pulling me into an awkward hug that felt more like an inspection. Her perfume was cloying, overwhelming. "I heard about everything. My heart just breaks for you. You must be so devastated. But you're a strong girl. You'll get through this." Her words were meant to sound kind, but her eyes were gleaming with the thrill of the gossip, hungry for details. In that moment, I wasn't Evelyn, the woman she had known for 30 years. I was a character in a drama she was enjoying from the sidelines. I felt my face burn with a shame so hot it felt like a fever, and I fled the bakery, leaving the bread on the counter, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of her pity. The family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a gray-haired man who had known us since we were children and had always smelled faintly of peppermint, called a meeting to discuss the details of our parents' inheritance. The four of us, me, Mark, Sarah, and now her own lawyer, sat around a large, polished mahogany table in a sterile conference room that smelled of old paper and betrayal. It was there that Sarah played her masterstroke. With her lawyer, a slick man with a predatory smile that never reached his eyes, she announced she would be contesting the will. Her argument was as simple as it was devastating. Given the delicate circumstances, her lawyer said, his voice a smooth, rehearsed purr, my client, Ms. Hayes, believes an equal division of the estate is no longer equitable. Her son, Leo, is, by blood, the grandson of her parents and the son of Mark Hayes. Therefore, it is the moral and financial responsibility of Mark, and by extension Evelyn, to provide for the child's future. We will be petitioning the court to have a significant portion of Evelyn's share of the inheritance placed in a trust for the child. My jaw dropped. The audacity of it, the sheer cold-blooded greed, took my breath away. Her plan was revealed in all its ugly glory. This wasn't about a moment of weakness or a broken heart. This was about money. She wasn't just trying to ruin my marriage. She was trying to steal my future, the security our parents had worked their entire lives to provide. She wanted to use her own child as a battering ram to smash my life and take what was mine. She wanted not just her half, but a significant portion of mine. She wanted it all. Mark, bless his honest heart, was a rock in that meeting. He endured the veiled accusations and judgmental stares with a silent dignity that broke my heart. It was he who suggested the obvious solution, the silver bullet that would end this nightmare. Then let's do a paternity test, he said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the tension in the room. That will settle the matter once and for all. But Sarah, in a move of pure Machiavellian genius, refused, and her refusal was a masterpiece of manipulation. She began to cry, great, body-racking sobs, clutching little Leo, whom she had conveniently brought along, to her chest. "A test?" she cried, her voice choked with perfectly feigned pain. "After everything I've been through? After being abandoned by him, having to face this pregnancy alone? Now you want to subject me to this humiliating ordeal. Your lack of faith is insult enough. I will not have my son treated like a piece of evidence in your little drama. He is a human being." And just like that, with that theatrical outburst, she flipped the script. To the onlookers, to Mr. Abernathy and the family members she had already primed, her refusal didn't look like the actions of a cornered liar. It looked like the actions of a deeply wounded woman whose pride and pain prevented her from enduring one more humiliation. She knew that doubt was her most powerful weapon, and she was using it to disarm me completely. We left that meeting with no resolution, only the threat of a long, ugly legal battle hanging over our heads. Her lie was solidifying, becoming an alternative truth that was gaining ground with terrifying speed. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a gray, featureless landscape of despair. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I'd lost weight, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes. The house, our once happy home, felt like a mausoleum for the life I had lost. I needed to escape, to do something with my hands, something that would distract me from the chaotic hum in my head. That was the day I decided to go to my parents' house, the Victorian house where we grew up, to begin the painful task of sorting through their belongings. It was a task I had been putting off, the finality of it too much to bear. But now felt necessary, a desperate pilgrimage to connect with the memory of the parents I knew before their legacy was twisted into this ugly weapon. I needed to remember who I was, where I came from, before Sarah rewrote our entire history. I drove there under a gray, overcast sky that perfectly mirrored my mood. The familiar landmarks of my childhood, the old movie theater with its peeling paint, the park where I first learned to ride a bike, seemed alien and distant, artifacts from another life, a life where sisters didn't try to destroy each other. The house stood silent and imposing at the end of the street, its familiar gables and wraparound porch seeming to watch me with a sad, knowing gaze. Letting myself in with the old key, I was immediately enveloped by the scent of them, my mother's, faint, lingering perfume of lavender, and my father's scent of sawdust and old books. The grief was a fresh wave, so powerful it buckled my knees. For a moment, I just stood in the foyer, my hand on the smooth, worn wood of the banister, and wept for the simple, uncomplicated love we had lost, a love that felt 1,000,000 miles, away from the ugliness that now defined my life. I forced myself to move, to work. I started in their bedroom, folding clothes that still held their scent, sorting through jewelry, each object a painful memory. Here was the locket my father gave, my mother on their 25th anniversary. Here were the cufflinks he wore to my wedding. It was both torture and a strange kind of comfort. After clearing the main floor, I turned my attention to the attic. It was a dusty time capsule of a place, filled with the ghosts of our past. I pulled down the folding stairs, the screech of the old springs echoing in the silent house. The attic was hot and stuffy, smelling of old paper and cedar. Shafts of pale light cut through the gloom from a single round window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It was a museum of our lives. My old dollhouse with its peeling wallpaper, Sarah's collection of dance trophies gleaming dully on a shelf, boxes of photo albums, my father's meticulously assembled model train set. Tucked away under a pile of old yearbooks and forgotten Christmas decorations was a locked metal strongbox. I vaguely remembered seeing it as a child, my father referring to it as where he kept the important stuff. My heart gave a little flutter of something. Hope? Curiosity? I didn't know. I went back downstairs to his old desk in the study and found the key in the top drawer, its brass cool and heavy in my hand. Back in the attic, with a click that echoed in the dusty silence, the lock opened. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled, among old, bundled love letters tied with a faded ribbon and a lock of my baby hair, was a worn leather folder labeled Personal Documents. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. I wasn't looking for a weapon. I was looking for my mother's old recipes, for some tangible piece of her to hold on to. But a weapon is what I found. Tucked inside a yellowed envelope, a single piece of paper would change everything. It was a report from a fertility clinic, dated over 30 years ago. It was from a time when my parents were considering having a third child. It was a detailed document, full of medical jargon I didn't understand, listing genetic markers, blood, types, and their complete medical histories. My eyes scanned the page, and then they landed on it. A discreet paragraph, typed by a fertility specialist, about my father. It mentioned a rare genetic condition, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. But the conclusion was written in plain, unambiguous English. Due to congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens, the patient is considered clinically sterile with a 0 probability of natural conception. The world stopped. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of attic light froze mid-air, sterile. My father was sterile. He couldn't have children. The word echoed in my mind, a silent, deafening thunderclap. This man, this wonderful, kind, patient man who had taught me how to read, who had held my hand at my wedding, was not my biological father, which meant I was not his biological daughter, and neither was Sarah. A wave of shock so profound and visceral it stole my breath washed over me. My parents, the people I adored, the anchors of my life, had kept this secret for our entire existence. The very floor beneath my feet seemed to disappear. But the shock was quickly followed by a dawning, electric realization that sliced through the grief. If the man who raised us wasn't our biological father, then it was highly unlikely that Sarah and I were full sisters. We were, at best, half-sisters, sharing the same mother. The secret life of my mother, a woman I had thought I knew completely, flashed before my eyes. A life with other men, other histories, other genetic codes. And then, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place with an audible snap in my mind. A memory surfaced, from years ago, so vivid it was as if I were there again. It was a silly, girlish conversation about blood donation in the college cafeteria. I could smell the stale pizza and hear the buzz of 100 conversations. My friend was complaining about not being able to donate blood. And Sarah, in her typically boastful way, had declared, "Well, I'm special. I'm type AB positive, the universal recipient. I can take from anyone." I remembered my own response, quiet and matter-of-fact. I'm the opposite, O negative, the universal donor. And in that moment, another fact surfaced from the recesses of my memory. Mark. I remembered when he had to have a minor surgery, and they confirmed his blood type. He was type O negative, just like me. My heart began to pound uncontrollably, not with panic, but with a fierce, rising excitement. My trembling fingers fumbled with my phone, a frantic search confirming what my intuition suddenly, instinctively knew. I scrolled through articles on Mendelian genetics, my eyes flying across the screen. There it was, in black and white, a fundamental law as immutable as gravity. A parent with type O blood, whose alleles are 2, cannot, under any circumstances, have a child with type AB blood, whose alleles are IAIB. To have an AB child, one parent must contribute the A allele and the other must contribute the B allele. A type O parent has neither of these alleles to give. It is a biological, genetic, and scientific impossibility. The lie, the vast, monstrous, destructive lie had a fatal flaw. Sarah, in her greed and arrogance, in her rush to construct the most painful narrative, had neglected a fundamental, unchangeable fact of science. Leo, her son, the centerpiece of this entire charade, could not be Mark's son. A strange, icy calm settled over me, extinguishing the fire of pain and confusion. The wound in my soul was still there, raw and open. But now it was accompanied by something else, a cold, clear purpose, as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. Sarah wanted a war. She had tried to burn my life to the ground with a lie. Well, I was about to fight back with the one thing she couldn't argue with, the truth, the scientific, irrefutable truth. And I would make damn sure that when her web of deceit collapsed, it would be in the most public and humiliating way possible. The plan began to form in my mind, not as an act of blind rage, but as a symphony of vengeance, with a crescendo that would be nothing short of spectacular. My sister had no idea who she was dealing with. She had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. She was about to learn that still waters run deep, and that the quietest people, when finally pushed to fight, are the most relentless. I drove home. From my parents' house, a different person than the one who had left that morning. The gray, oppressive sky hadn't changed, but my perception of it had. It no longer seemed to mirror my despair. It seemed like a blank canvas, a sky full of cold, clear potential. I was no longer a victim driving through a fog of confusion. I was a general driving to her command center, the intricate battle plans already beginning to take shape in my mind. The old documents lay on the passenger seat beside me, their yellowed paper feeling more solid and real than anything had in weeks. They were not just papers, they were my Declaration of Independence, my Articles of War. I found Mark in the living room, in the same armchair he'd occupied for what felt like an eternity, staring blankly at a television screen that wasn't on. The exhaustion was etched into every line on his face, a roadmap of the hell Sarah had put us through. He looked up as I entered, his expression weary, expecting another evening of strained silence. But then he saw my face. He must have seen the change, the new light of purpose in my eyes, because he sat up straighter, his own eyes narrowing with a flicker of cautious curiosity. "Evelyn? What is it? You look—" He trailed off, unable to find the word. "Different," I finished for him. I didn't speak at first. I walked over to the coffee table, the space that had become a no man's land between us, and laid down the yellowed envelope. The sound it made on the polished wood was soft, but it felt as loud as a gavel. "I need you to read this," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued it for weeks. "And then, I need to ask you to forgive me." He looked at me, his brow furrowed, then down at the papers. He picked them up with a hesitant hand and began to read. I watched his face as he processed the information, a slow-motion cascade of emotions. Confusion morphed into astonishment, his mouth falling slightly agape. His eyes scanned the page again, as if unable to believe the words. He looked up at me, speechless, and in that moment I explained everything, the words tumbling out of me. In a rush of newfound clarity, my father's condition, the shocking revelation that we were not his biological daughters, and the final, irrefutable scientific conclusion about the blood types. His type O and mine, and Sarah's type AB. The biological, genetic, scientific impossibility of her claim. I watched as the dawn of understanding broke across his features, followed by a wave of relief so profound and so palpable it was as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He slumped back in the chair, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, the haunted, sorrowful look was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen in a long, long time, a spark of righteous, cleansing anger. An anger not at me, but at the injustice, at the calculated, venomous slander we had endured. He stood up, walked around the coffee table, and pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I broke down. I finally allowed myself to shatter. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, these weren't the corrosive tears of doubt or despair. They were tears of pure, cathartic relief, washing away the weeks of poison and fear. I wept for the man I had doubted, for the trust I had allowed my sister to tarnish, for the precious time we had lost to her lies. "You have nothing to apologize for," he whispered fiercely into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing. Do you hear me? She cornered us. She used the worst pain of our lives against us, twisted it into a weapon. But it's over, Evelyn. We know the truth. It's over." "Not yet," I said, pulling back to look him in the eye, feeling a new, shared strength flowing between us, a current of unified purpose. "She started this in public. She tried to humiliate us in front of everyone we know. And that's where it's going to end. I'm not just going to prove she's lying, Mark. I am going to dismantle her life with the truth, piece by painstaking piece, the same way she tried to dismantle ours with a lie." Mark looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a slow, determined smile spread across his face. It was the smile of the man I had married, the man of principle, the historian who believed in the power of facts. He saw the cold, hard justice in my plan. In that moment, we were no longer victims cowering in the ruins of our life. We were partners. We were a team. And we were going to war. The second step of my plan was to gather an arsenal of irrefutable, legally sound proof. The old medical document was a powerful start, but it was circumstantial regarding our parentage and could potentially be challenged as outdated. I needed something official, modern, and undeniable. That led me to a private investigator. After a long night of careful online research into discreet and, more importantly, ruthless professionals, I found a man named Mr. Davies. His sparse website promised unassailable facts and absolute discretion. His office was on the third floor of a rundown building downtown, a world away from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. The air in the hallway smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes. The office itself was cluttered, with files stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. Mr. Davies himself was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his late 50s, with a weary, bloodhound face that suggested he had seen the worst of human nature and was thoroughly unimpressed by it. I told him the story, laying out the facts calmly and concisely, pushing copies of the documents I'd found across his cluttered desk. He listened patiently, his shrewd eyes revealing nothing, his large, calloused fingers steepled under his chin. He didn't interrupt. "Just let me speak," his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. He picked up the copy of the fertility report and examined it under the harsh light of his desk lamp. "Blood types and genetics," he finally grunted, a flicker of something like professional respect in his tired eyes. "It's always the smart ones who get caught by the simple stuff. Liars, they get so caught up in the emotional details they forget about the science." He leaned back in his creaky chair, which groaned in protest. "So, you want official copies of your birth certificates to prove the half-sister angle, and you want to find out who her biological father was, just to seal the deal." "Exactly," I said. "I want every piece of her story to be proven a lie." He nodded slowly. "This is messy. Family stuff always is. The dirtiest fights I've ever seen have been over wills. But it's clean, too. Facts are facts. They don't have feelings." He named his price, which was steep but fair. I agreed without hesitation, pulling my checkbook from my purse. "All right, Mrs. Hayes," he said, extending a calloused hand that enveloped mine in a surprisingly firm grip. "Leave it with me. I'll get you what you need." As I left his office and stepped back out into the city streets, I felt a weight lift. The gears were turning. The counteroffensive had begun. While Mr. Davies delved into the paper trails of the past, my own efforts were focused on the present. The keystone of my entire plan, the piece of evidence that would transform my argument from a compelling theory into an irrefutable fact, was Leo's DNA. I needed to get a sample, but it had to be done in a way that wouldn't raise a single shred of suspicion in Sarah's ever-watchful, paranoid mind. An overt request was out of the question. She would spin it as further harassment, another attempt to discredit a grieving single mother. The approach had to be subtle, a Trojan horse of kindness and generosity. Sarah had always been obsessed with appearances, with the symbols of status and wealth. Her entire life was a curated performance of affluence she didn't quite possess. It was this vanity, this Achilles heel, that I decided to exploit. I spent an afternoon browsing the websites of high-end department stores, searching for the perfect bait. And then I found it, a beautiful sterling silver rattle from a renowned luxury brand whose name alone made Sarah go weak at the knees. It was classic, ostentatious, and absurdly expensive, exactly the kind of object Sarah would adore, not for its function, but for the name engraved on its polished surface. It was the type of gift she would feel compelled to show off, to casually leave on a coffee table for visitors to see. And, most importantly, it was a toy that Leo, at his age, would inevitably put in his mouth, covering it with the saliva that contained the very genetic code I needed. To build the illusion of genuine goodwill and allay any suspicion, I also purchased a secondary gift, a soft, ridiculously overpriced cashmere blanket, and had it gift-wrapped and sent to her apartment a week in advance. I included a handwritten note on thick, cream-colored cardstock. "Sarah, I saw this and thought of you, and my beautiful nephew. I have another small gift for him, but it's being personally engraved. It should be ready soon. Thinking of you. Love, Evelyn." This served two purposes. It lulled her into a false sense of security, making my next move seem like a natural continuation of a peace offering, and it established the idea of a main gift yet to come, building her anticipation for something even more luxurious. My chosen stage for this grand revelation was the annual City Charity Gala. It was the pinnacle of our town's social calendar, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of the historic City Hall. It was a sea of designer gowns, bespoke tuxedos, and clinking champagne glasses, where the city's elite gathered to congratulate each other on their philanthropy, while subtly jockeying for social position. It was the absolute zenith of the world Sarah so desperately craved to conquer. She had used the court of public opinion to wage her war. I was determined to use the same battlefield for my final, decisive victory. It was there, under the brilliant light of crystal chandeliers and in front of an audience of her peers, that the truth would be revealed. The weeks leading up to the gala were a masterclass in self-control. Mark and I had to continue playing our parts in this twisted family drama. We attended a mandatory Sunday dinner with our extended family, an excruciating ordeal where we endured the sympathetic glances and the awkward silences. Sarah was there, of course, playing the role of the tragic martyr to perfection. She looked tired but beautiful, her face pale in a way that highlighted her sorrow. She held Leo close, a living, breathing prop in her performance. She spoke in hushed, fragile tones about the struggles of motherhood, never looking directly at Mark, but ensuring everyone in the room felt the weight of her unspoken accusation. I watched her, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. The sister I had loved was gone, replaced by this calculating stranger. I simply had to play my part, offering polite smiles and non-committal responses, all while the clock was ticking down to her spectacular self-immolation. In a stroke of ironic luck that felt like a nod of approval from the universe itself, Sarah's campaign of self-pity had worked even better than she could have hoped. The gala organizer, a woman named Beatrice Vance, who had a keen eye for a compelling human interest story that could loosen the wallets of her wealthy donors, heard about Sarah's plight. She had been completely captivated by the narrative of the beautiful, young single mother, abandoned by a powerful man and left to raise her child alone. Beatrice invited Sarah not just to attend the gala, but to be a featured speaker, to say a few words about her journey as an example of courageous motherhood in the face of adversity. When I heard the news from Aunt Carol, who called me practically breathless with pride for Sarah, a slow, cold smile touched my lips. Sarah wasn't just attending the event. She was voluntarily stepping into the spotlight. She was building her own pedestal, making her inevitable fall all the higher and all the more spectacular. Mr. Davies delivered his findings with quiet, professional efficiency 2 weeks before the gala. He met me in a discreet coffee shop, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside were the official sealed copies of our birth certificates from the state archives. As I had suspected, they listed different fathers. My biological father was an anonymous donor from a university fertility study, a fact discreetly noted in the hospital records from decades ago. Sarah's biological father was a man my mother had a brief, passionate affair with during a period when she and the man I'd always called Dad had temporarily separated, before eventually reconciling and choosing to raise us both as their own. The revelation was an echo of the shock I'd felt in the attic, but this time it was devoid of personal pain. It was just another fact, another round of ammunition for my arsenal. We were indeed only half-sisters. This fact was crucial. It would serve to further isolate Sarah, to show that our bond was not as sacrosanct as she had led everyone to believe, making her betrayal seem even more monstrous. The plan to retrieve the rattle was the riskiest part of the entire operation. I called Sarah and, feigning a desire for reconciliation, I invited her to a quiet dinner at a neutral restaurant. "I think Mom and Dad would have wanted us to try and find a way through this," I said, my voice carefully measured to sound sincere and slightly weary. To my surprise, she agreed. Her arrogance was now so inflated that she likely saw it as an opportunity for me to surrender, to beg for a truce on her terms. The dinner was tense and horrible, an exercise in biting my tongue until it nearly bled. She spoke at length about her hardships, about how Leo was the only thing that kept her going. I listened, nodding sympathetically, my stomach churning with revulsion. Towards the end of the meal, I brought up the rattle, which she had, as predicted, brought along in her designer diaper bag. "It's just beautiful, Evelyn," she'd said when I gave it to her earlier, her eyes gleaming with acquisitive delight. "I'm so glad you like it," I said now, forcing a smile. "But you know, I noticed a tiny flaw in the engraving when I picked it up. It's been bothering me. The jeweler said they'd fix it for free if I brought it back. Could I possibly take it for a few days?" It was a gamble, but I was counting on her greed. She wouldn't want a flawed luxury item, nor would she risk offending me when I was seemingly on the verge of capitulating. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing suspiciously, but then she relented. "Oh, of course," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "if you think it's necessary." She handed it over, wrapped in a silk cloth. My fingers closed around it, and I could feel the faint warmth and dampness of where Leo had been chewing on it. I had my sample. The next morning, I sent the rattle to a private DNA lab Mr. Davies had recommended, along with a toothbrush Mark had used. I registered them under false names, a small act of spycraft that made my heart pound. The report arrived via a secure email portal 2 days before the gala. I opened the attached PDF, my breath held tight in my chest. The result was stark and absolute. Probability of paternity, 0%. It was the final nail, the concrete, undeniable word of science that would obliterate her lie. On the night of the gala, as I prepared, a supernatural calm descended upon me. The nervous energy of the past weeks had solidified into a focused, diamond-hard resolve. I chose a simple but elegant dress in a deep, blood-red silk. It was not meant to compete with the sparkle of Sarah's inevitable gown, but to symbolize the strength and the truth I now carried within me. I wore no flashy jewelry. My arsenal was tucked neatly into a small, elegant clutch, the DNA report, the copies of our birth certificates, and the old medical document about my father. Each paper was a loaded weapon, waiting to be fired. Mark took my hand as we were about to leave. He looked magnificent in his tuxedo, but there was a tension in his jaw. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "I've never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied, and it was the purest truth I had ever spoken. We entered the grand ballroom, and the scene was a dizzying assault on the senses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hothouse flowers. A string orchestra played a soaring classical piece from a balcony overhead, its beautiful melody a stark, ironic counterpoint to the ugly drama about to unfold. Light from a dozen massive crystal chandeliers fractured into a million shimmering diamonds, glinting off sequins, diamonds, and the polished surfaces of champagne flutes. It was a world of curated perfection, a stage meticulously set for the city's elite to perform their roles. And tonight, I was no longer a reluctant audience member. I was the playwright, about to introduce a devastating plot twist. Mark's hand was a warm, solid presence in the small of my back, a silent anchor in the swirling sea of faces and forced laughter. We moved through the crowd, a united front. The whispers started almost immediately, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. I could feel the eyes on us, the quick, curious glances followed by hushed conversations behind cupped hands. "There they are," the looks seemed to say, "the cheating husband and the poor, deluded wife." I met their gazes without flinching, a small, calm smile on my lips. Let them whisper, I thought. Let them enjoy their final moments of ignorant judgment. Soon they would have something real to talk about. I spotted Sarah across the room almost immediately. She was holding court near the grand staircase, a magnet for attention, draped in a silver sequined gown that glittered with every movement, making her look as if she were cast in liquid moonlight. She held Leo, who was dressed in a miniature tuxedo, a living, breathing prop in her elaborate deception. She looked radiant, her face a carefully constructed mask of tragic beauty. She was basking in the waves of sympathy and admiration that rolled towards her, the martyred queen in her element. She saw me, and a condescending, victorious smile touched her lips, It was a smile that said, "You see, this is my world. These are my people. You have already lost." She had no idea her reign was about to come to a very abrupt, very public end. The time for the speeches arrived. The mayor gave a tedious, self-congratulatory address, followed by Beatrice Vance, the gala organizer, who spoke passionately about the charity's work. Then, with her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, she introduced the evening's special guest speaker. "And now," she said, her voice amplified throughout the silent hall, "it is my distinct honor to introduce a woman whose quiet strength and resilience in the face of personal hardship is an inspiration to us all. Please welcome the courageous Sarah Hayes." With a practiced, demure modesty that made my stomach turn, Sarah walked to the stage under a wave of warm, heartfelt applause. She gently rocked the impeccably dressed Leo in her arms, her silver gown, shimmering under the spotlight, turning her into an angelic, tragic vision of sorrow and strength. She reached the podium and looked out at the sea of adoring faces, a single, perfect tear already glistening on her cheek. Her performance was breathtaking in its audacity. She spoke of the challenges of being a new mother, of the heartbreak, of a love that went wrong, her voice cracking at all the right moments. She never mentioned Mark or me by name, but she didn't have to. Every single person in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. The sympathy for her was palpable, a thick, cloying wave of sentimental poison that washed over the entire room. "Everything I do," she concluded, her voice a choked whisper, the single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek, "I do for him, to ensure he has the life he deserves, even if it means fighting the world alone." The room erupted in heartfelt applause. People were visibly moved. Men and women dabbed at their eyes with their linen napkins. Sarah had utterly captivated them. She had cemented her status as a victim, a saint, and in that moment, I knew it was my time. As the applause began to fade, I stood up from my chair. The sound of my seat scraping slightly on the polished floor was enough to draw the attention of the nearby tables. I started walking toward the stage, my red dress a slash of color in the sea of black and silver, the small clutch containing my documents held firmly in one hand. A hush began to fall over the tables closest to my path as people turned to stare, their faces a mixture of confusion and eager anticipation. The air crackled with the sudden, unspoken promise of drama. Sarah's triumphant smile wavered, a tiny crack in her flawless facade as she saw me approaching. But she recovered quickly, her expression shifting to one of saccharine sweetness, a look of beatific forgiveness for the poor, delusional sister who was about to make a scene. Beatrice Vance, the organizer, looking flustered and alarmed, intercepted me near the steps to the stage. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, her voice a tense hiss. "What are you doing?" "I would just like to say a few words," I replied calmly, my voice betraying no emotion, my gaze fixed on my sister, "and to give a gift to my brave sister and my nephew." Intrigued by the potential for even more heart-wrenching drama, and perhaps unable to think of a polite way to refuse, Beatrice hesitated, then nodded and gestured for me to join them at the podium. Sarah couldn't object without looking petty and cruel. She handed me the microphone, her fingers brushing mine, her touch surprisingly cold. Her eyes, however, shot daggers of pure, unadulterated warning. "Don't you dare!" they screamed. "Sarah," I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing through the now silent ballroom. Every eye in the room was on me. "Your performance was, as always, incredibly moving. Everyone here can see how much you love your son." I paused, letting the compliment, which was actually a veiled insult about her acting, hang in the air. "And I have a gift for you and for Leo." I reached into my clutch and pulled out not the documents, but the heavy, sterling silver rattle. I held it up, its polished surface reflecting the brilliant lights of the chandeliers. a beacon of truth, in a room full of illusions. This is for Leo, a little something for him to remember this night. I handed it to her. As our fingers brushed, our eyes met, and in that instant I saw a flash of cold, calculating assessment in her gaze. She still thought she was in control, that this was some pathetic attempt at a truce. Then I turned back to the audience. "And I have another gift," I said, my voice resonating through the hushed ballroom, each word carefully enunciated. "The gift of truth." Sarah's smile froze, turning into a brittle porcelain mask. I opened my clutch again and laid the folder of documents on the podium, the sound of the papers rustling, amplified by the microphone. "My sister has painted a very compelling picture of betrayal and heartbreak," I said, my voice gaining strength. With every word, a cold fire burning in my veins. A story of a cheating husband and a grieving sister finding comfort in the wrong arms. It's a tragic story, elegantly told. But there's a problem with her story. A rather significant, scientific problem. I held up the first document, the DNA lab report, its official letterhead clearly visible. "This is a paternity test. It was performed last week using a DNA sample from Leo, obtained from this very rattle after he had spent a lovely afternoon chewing on it, and a sample from my husband, Mark. This report proves, conclusively and with 99.99% certainty, that Mark Hayes is not the father of Leo." A collective gasp swept through the room, a hissing sound like a receding wave. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Sarah's face lost all its color, draining away to a pasty, sickly white. Her smile twisted into a grotesque parody of happiness, her lips pulled back over her teeth in a rictus of raw panic. That's absurd," she stammered into the microphone she still held, her voice a high-pitched squeak. "That's a fake. You're desperate. You faked it." "Desperate?" I repeated, my voice now laced with an icy calm that seemed to drop the temperature in the room. "No, Sarah. Just meticulous. You see, I could stop right there. The word of a certified lab is usually enough. But I want everyone here to understand the sheer depth of your deception. Because the truth is, Mark could never, ever have been Leo's father. And that is a fact of basic biology." My gaze swept across the audience, a sea of stunned, rapt faces. They were no longer whispering. They were completely silent, hanging on my every word. "I have type O negative blood. My husband, Mark, also has type O negative blood. This is a high school biology lesson, but allow me to offer a refresher. 2. Parents with type O blood can only have children with type O blood. It is a genetic impossibility for them to have a child with any other blood type." I paused, letting the weight of my words, the simple, irrefutable science, settle upon the stunned crowd. "And Sarah, my dear sister, has type AB positive blood. Leo's blood type, as listed on his birth certificate, is also AB positive." I turned my head and looked directly at Sarah, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes were blazing with a hatred so intense it was almost a physical force. "So, you see, it was never a question of if Mark was the father. It is scientifically, genetically, and biologically impossible." A murmur started in the room, a low, shocked rumble that grew into a roar of overlapping conversations. The foundation of Sarah's story had not just cracked, it had been pulverized. Her castle of cards was collapsing in real time. But I wasn't finished. I was going to reduce it to dust and scatter the ashes. "But why?" I continued, my voice dropping to a dramatic hush, forcing the crowd to lean in, to strain to hear. Why would she invent a lie that was so easily disproven? A lie that insults the intelligence of anyone who passed 9th grade science? Because, ladies and gentlemen, in her rush to destroy my marriage and claim my inheritance, she forgot about a little family secret, a secret our parents kept for our entire lives. I held up the copies of our birth certificates and the old medical report, fanning them out for all to see. These documents prove two things. First, that the wonderful man who raised us, the man we both called Dad, was biologically sterile. He was a magnificent father, but he could not have children. And second, that Sarah and I have different biological fathers. We are not full sisters. We are only half-sisters, connected only by the mother who bore us. The final revelation landed in the room like a bomb. The gasp this time was even louder, sharper, laced with a new layer of scandal. The story was no longer just about a paternity lie. It was about a lifetime of secrets and deception, a family history far more complex and sordid than anyone could have imagined. Sarah's humiliation was now complete and absolute. She wasn't just a liar, she was a fool, caught in a web of her own making, undone by fundamental facts she was either too arrogant or too ignorant to consider. The silence in the room was now absolute, deafening. Then, slowly, as if pulled by a single string, every eye turned to Sarah. She stood on the stage as if she had been turned to stone, the silver rattle clutched in her hand like a weapon that had turned against her. The warm, flattering spotlight, which moments before had bathed her in a worshipful glow, now seemed like a harsh, unforgiving interrogation lamp, exposing every inch of her fraud. Her face, which had been a canvas of fury, now crumpled into something else, the raw, ugly face of utter and total defeat. My work was done. I hadn't screamed or cried. I hadn't resorted to insults or personal attacks. I had simply, calmly, and methodically presented the truth, armed with evidence. And the truth, in its beautiful, undeniable clarity, was more devastating to Sarah's reputation than any emotional outburst could ever have been. I stepped away from the podium, leaving the folder of documents lying there like a final verdict. Mark met me at the foot of the stairs, his arm wrapping around me in a gesture of love and support that was now, finally, free of any shadow. His eyes were shining with a mixture of pride and relief. Together, we turned our backs on the chaos, on the shocked whispers that were now erupting into a full-blown roar, and on the face of my sister, which was now contorted with a mixture of hatred and utter, soul-crushing humiliation. We walked through the stunned crowd, a path parting before us as if we were royalty, and headed for the grand doors of the ballroom. We walked out into the cool night air, leaving behind not just a ruined party, but the smoldering wreckage of Sarah's life. The karma she had so carelessly and arrogantly ignored had finally and spectacularly arrived to collect its debt. The aftermath of the gala was a social firestorm. In a single devastating moment on that stage, Sarah had gone from a figure of sympathy to an instant pariah. The story of her deception, complete with the scandalous family secrets I had revealed, spread through our town and the social circles she valued so much with the speed of a wildfire. Every telling was more embellished and condemnatory than the last. She was exposed not just as a liar, but as a cruel and calculating manipulator, willing to destroy her own sister's life and use her innocent child as a pawn for financial gain. The same community that had embraced her with pity now looked upon her with cold, absolute contempt. She and I never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. The bond of sisterhood, already strained and corroded by years of her silent envy, had been irrevocably obliterated. The bridges weren't just burned, they were vaporized. I heard, through the hushed whispers of distant relatives, that she left town a few weeks later, unable to bear the shame, the judgmental stares, and the doors that were now firmly closed to her. She fled from the disaster she had created, the legal battle over the inheritance, which she had initiated with such arrogant confidence, ended before it even truly began. Her lawyer, realizing his client's untenable position and the risk of sanctions for frivolous litigation, formally withdrew her contest of the will. Her claim, based on a lie that had been so publicly and thoroughly debunked, vanished into thin air. The Victorian house, the money, the legacy our parents had worked to build, was now safe under my care. Life, slowly but surely, began to return to a new kind of normal. The whispers that followed me in the supermarket were replaced by words of support and, in many cases, apologies. Friends who had distanced themselves, swayed by Sarah's lies, reached out, their expressions a mixture of shame and relief. Mark and I, our love tested in the fire of adversity, found a new depth in our relationship. The trust that had been shaken was not just restored, it was reinforced, tempered into steel. We had survived the worst storm imaginable and emerged, on the other side, hand in hand, stronger than ever before. We decided to sell the family home. It held too many memories, good and bad, and the ghost of Sarah's betrayal lingered in its hallways. We needed a fresh start, a place that was solely ours. We bought a house on the coast, a place with large windows that opened up to the vastness of the ocean. The online bookstore I had started as a passion project continued to flourish, a testament to the power of stories, a theme that had become so central to my own life. Years passed. Mark and I had our own children, a daughter and a son, who filled our home with loud, pure joy. We raised them with the values our parents had taught us: honesty, integrity, and the importance of treating others with kindness. I never found out who Leo's real father was. That was Sarah's secret to keep, her burden to bear. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think of him. I think of that innocent little boy whose start in life was marked by such a profound deception. I pray that wherever they are, Sarah found a way to be the mother he deserved. A mother who would teach him the value of truth by showing him a different path than the one she herself had walked. The moral of this story isn't simply that cheaters never prosper or that lies will always be found out. It's something deeper, something I learned in the stillness that followed the storm. It's about the corrosive nature of greed and the unyielding power of truth. Sarah, in her desperate quest for a life she felt she was owed, a life of ease and admiration, forgot that the things that truly matter, like love, trust, and integrity, cannot be bought, stolen, or manufactured. They must be earned, nurtured, and protected. She looked at my life, at my quiet marriage, at my fulfilling work, and she didn't see happiness. She saw assets she wanted for herself. And in her attempt to take what was mine, she lost the only thing she truly possessed: herself. She had defined herself for so long by what she lacked, by the perceived injustices done to her, that when her grand scheme for acquiring my life failed, there was nothing left of her own. She became a hollow vessel, filled only with bitterness and the echoes of a public shaming she could never escape. As for me, I learned that even in the darkest moments, when the world seems to be collapsing around you, when betrayal comes from the very people you are supposed to trust with your life, there is always a path forward. It may not be the path you planned, but it is a path nonetheless. I learned that the quiet strength that had always been a part of my nature was not a weakness to be exploited, but a deep well of resilience. It was the strength of the oak tree, not the hurricane, less dramatic, but far harder to uproot. And I learned that karma, though it may sometimes be slow and take winding roads, is always, in the end, just. My sister tried to steal my inheritance, my husband, and my happiness. But in the end, the only thing she managed to lose was her own soul. And I, in the quiet moments, watching the sunset paint the ocean in hues of orange and purple, with the man I love beside me and the sound of our children laughing in the background, know that I have gained something far more valuable than anything our parents could have left us in a will. I have gained peace. The peace that comes from living an authentic life, the peace that comes from standing up for the truth, and the peace that comes from knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, who you are and what you fight for. And that is an inheritance no one can ever take away from me. If this story resonated with you in any way, if you have ever felt the sharp sting of betrayal, especially from someone who was supposed to protect you, I invite you to join our community. Your experience, your voice, matters here, and together we can show that integrity and truth are forces to be reckoned with. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any inspiring and real stories like this one. Hit that notification bell to be notified every time a new video drops. Leave a like if you believe that the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried under lies, always finds a way to the surface, often in spectacular fashion. And if you know someone who needs to hear this powerful message of resilience and justice, someone who might be facing their own silent battle against falsehood, please share this video with them. And now, the most important question for you, our amazing audience, the heart of this community. Have you ever been the target of envy or greed from someone very close to you, a family member or a dear friend? How did you handle the situation when a lie was used to try and harm you? What was your path to reclaiming your peace and your dignity? Share your honest, heartfelt experiences in the comments section below. Your story might be the next one to inspire someone, to give them the courage they need to stand up for themselves. Let's build a supportive community where dignity, truth, and resilience are always celebrated and uplifted. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this journey.